Hello, hello. Lovely to have you here. What I want to talk about today is are topics in philosophy, in particular metaphysics, which is for some people sort of the foundational aspect, the sort of first aspect that we learn in philosophy. And what did the Buddha have to say about metaphysics? So that's going to be the topic of today's video. To begin with, I certainly have to say and emphasize that metaphysics itself is a topic, a concept from Western philosophy. It essentially derives from Aristotle. It literally means the material, the book after the physics. Metaphysics means after the physics. And so, in a sense, we're taking a concept that is alien or foreign to Buddhism and asking what the Buddha might have to say about it. So I think we have to keep that in mind. But nevertheless, I think there are things that we can say about it when we come to Buddhism. We have to do some interpretation. So what do we mean by metaphysics? Given that we're not talking just about the book after the physics in the case of Aristotle, that's not really relevant. What we mean when we talk about metaphysics, there's, of course, you could do a whole course on it. I mean, you could spend a lifetime on it. But in a really tight nutshell, it's basically can be broken into two parts. One is what there is, otherwise known as ontology, and the other aspect of it is sort of how what there is organized or structured or put together. And those are sort of the basic topics that we deal with in metaphysics. So the question is, what did the Buddha have to say about what there was and how it was put together or organized? Well, when we look to early Buddhism, the suttas of early Buddhism, we actually find some pretty clear answers to these questions. As for the question of what there is, here is what the Buddha had to say. What do the astute deem as existing, which I too say exists? Form that is impermanent, suffering, and perishable, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness that is impermanent, suffering, and perishable. So here in this very compact little statement, the Buddha is telling us an awful lot. He's actually telling us what he thinks exist, that is ontology, as well as a little bit about how it's structured. But let's begin with what exists. So first, what exists is form. Well, what is form? Form is a technical term in early Buddhism. Basically, it means the sort of objects in the world around us, what we might call physical objects. The body is sort of the primary one because we're dealing with persons here. But we can also think of other things as having form. Trees, chairs, tables, cars, chariots, houses, the earth. All of these things are forms. And forms themselves are constructed of parts as well, which the Buddha discusses elsewhere, that forms in particular are constructed out of the four elements. Sometimes there are 5 or 6 elements. I'll just deal with the 4 elements picture now: earth, air, fire, and water. And these elements, sometimes again there are 5 or 6, the 5th one being a space into which the forms denote space. If we think of space as an element, we can think of it that way. Another one is consciousness, which isn't really relevant to the case of physical things. But in any event, every physical thing for the Buddha is constructed out of earth, air, fire, and water. And he doesn't further analyze earth, air, fire, and water into separate things. It's not like earth is made out of these smaller things, but rather there's just earth, air, fire, and water. So we might think of those, we might consider those to be sort of the basic elements out of which all physical things are created, that they're sort of the basic ontology of early Buddhism. We might think of it that way, although importantly, the Buddha never says that. So we have to be a little careful here. It's natural to consider that earth, air, fire, and water are sort of the basic constituents out of which for the Buddha all matter is constructed. But again, that's not something the Buddha actually says. And we'll sort of come back to a bit of that at the end here. And then, after talking about form, the Buddha mentions 4 of what we might call mental aggregates. Volitional formations, feelings, consciousness, perceptions. I got the order wrong there, but anyway, those are the 4 types of mental things. And each of those is further able to be subdivided into parts. In particular, there's a part for each a perceptual sense. So, for example, when we're talking about perceptions, there's visual perception, auditory perception, taste, smell, touch, and mental perceptions. And of course, it's going to be somewhat tedious to go through all 4 of these cases and all of the 6 subdivisions, but we get the point. All of these can be subdivided into parts. And we might say that all of these are events or occurrences that happen, that exist for the Buddha. A mental event, an event of visual perception, is something that exists for the Buddha. An event of a visual consciousness or a visual feeling, a pleasant visual feeling, that kind of thing. These are things that exist for the Buddha. Another category of things that exist for the Buddha are what are known as the realms of existence. So there's the human realm into which we are born. There's the animal realm. It's a kind of a way of existence, a method of existence in which animals exist, a way that they approach the world. We might say that the human realm and the animal realm are the same in the sense that we both live with each other, but there also are, for the Buddha, hell realms and heaven realms that are separate from here, that aren't literally here. We can understand these in various ways, but for the Buddha, they were understood as real places. They were real hell realms and real heaven realms. And also, all of these realms could be subdivided again. So it's not just that there was one hell realm, but that there were several. It was not just that there was one heaven realm, but there were many. In particular, the heaven realms for the Buddha, he spent quite a while talking about different heaven realms that could be achieved from given various states of deep meditative absorption. So these heaven realms were associated with states of meditation. If we were proficient in certain meditative abilities, such as the ability to reach certain deep states of jhanic meditation, which were very pleasant, we could be potentially reborn in the corresponding heaven realm after we died. That was one of the things that the Buddha seems to have believed and certainly asserted. Or to be careful here, there always are going to be disagreements, discussions between people about what really the Buddha believed and what really he asserted. At the very least, what I'm talking about here are claims that we find in these early texts in general. And there are going to be disagreements about which parts of these texts go back how far and so on. But I'm going to leave that kind of discussion for specialists. There certainly is no general agreement about that in the field. But in any event, this text takes us to the next topic, which is how these things that exist are structured. And for the Buddha, there are 2 main aspects to all of reality. The first, and I would argue perhaps the most important aspect, at least to us, in an everyday sense, is that all things are impermanent and perishable. Nothing lasts for more than a very, very short period of time. The Buddha doesn't say how long things last for. The exact structure of that persistence is something that later Buddhism got into, discussions of what's known as momentariness. But for early Buddhism, all we need to know is that things are impermanent and perishable, as the Buddha said in that quote that I started off with. The second key aspect of all of reality is that it is non-self. This is the most extensive fact about reality, is that all reality is non-self. Now, what does that really mean? Well, there are various aspects to it. One aspect of non-self we've already covered, is that nothing is permanent. That is, there's no permanent self to anything. There's no permanent essence to anything that persists through vast stretches of time. There's no permanent soul within us. that persists from moment to moment or from lifetime to lifetime or whatever. So there's an aspect of non-self that is basically the same as impermanence, that's just saying the same thing in a different way. But there's another aspect to non-self as well. That is to say, when we come at the world from a first-person perspective, there's nothing that we can identify that first-person perspective with in our experience that serves as who we really are, that is our self. We cannot find a self within our experience. That is, for the Buddha, consciousness, or we might say the first-person perspective, is a thing. There is a way things are from our perspective, this subjectivity, if you like. Subjectivity is a thing, but there's no permanent internal subject that continues from moment to moment. That subject is always changing. All that we have, we might say, is a stream of various states of subjectivity that follow one another, that are brought into being by one another, that are causally integrated into one another in a way, but they're not literally the same kind. They're not literally the same subjectivity over time. They're not the same consciousness over time. Indeed, as we've already said, consciousness comes in 6 flavors: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so on. And these kinds of consciousness or subjectivity are always changing. Another key aspect of the structure that is discussed in the early Buddhist Dharma, the structure of the world, is that karma is real. Karma works. That whatever we experience in later times is going to be, at least in part, due to our intentions and actions at prior times. Or if you like, in a more accurate way of putting things, in this stream, this kind of multi-causal stream of physical and mental events that constitutes our conventional idea of a self, the intentions and actions that come out of that stream at earlier times influence what happens to the stream at later times. And this all seems to suggest that another thing we might expect to find in early Buddhism is some idea of what we might term karmic seeds, the seeds laid down by our intentions and actions. And indeed, in early Buddhism, we find concepts such as our underlying tendencies, or anusayas, or our upayadhi, or our substrata. These are concepts, sort of technical concepts that are discussed somewhat cryptically in early Buddhism. That is to say, there's not a lot said about them, but they seem to incorporate some of this notion of this karmic baggage, or these karmic seeds that we've laid down in the past that then ripen at a later time. However, a lot of this discussion about karma, as well as discussions, let's say, about dukkha, which is another aspect of reality that's discussed in early Buddhism, and concepts of what's known as dependent origination, which talk about a sort of a causal picture in early Buddhism, these sort of skirt the line between being topics in metaphysics and being topics in what I would term philosophy of mind, that is to say, how the mind works. These, in many ways, the Buddha's interest in metaphysics, and indeed in all of his philosophy and all of his Dharma, was to discuss the mind and the way the mind works. So there's a close relationship between what we might term the metaphysics and the philosophy of mind here, but what I want to do is to leave those topics for a separate video on philosophy of mind, and we'll get to those in a little bit of detail there. But I just want to say this to say that these are other aspects of the structure of reality, dependent origination, how certain mental states, certain kinds of states arise out of others, with this kind of causal picture that we find in dependent origination. Now, having said all of that about the Buddha's metaphysics, for some of you it will seem as though I've been sort of skirting the main question here. That is the Buddha a metaphysical realist, or is he not? That is to say, does he think that these things that I've been discussing here, that they exist in the real world, that they're out there in some sense separate from us? Or is he what we might term nowadays a phenomenologist, That is, claiming that all these things I've been discussing are not really aspects of the world independent from us, but are only appearances that appear to us in certain ways, that they're not separate from us. Now, in the Abhidhamma or Abhidharma, which is a philosophy that arose in the decades and centuries after the Buddha's lifetime as a way to structure and interpret the Buddha's philosophy, in the Abhidhamma, these are interpreted more or less realistically. That is, that these things really exist, that they're separate from us in some sense, that they're real ways things can be. However, in other later schools of Buddhism, these notions in the Abhidharma were challenged, and other theories came forward. In particular, we can talk about the Yogacara school, in which all of these kinds of metaphysical claims I've been discussing here are interpreted, we might say, phenomenologically. That these things, these forms and feelings and so on, these are only phenomena. They're only appearances to us. They're not actually separate from minds, from our mind, let's say. Also, many contemporary interpreters of Buddhist philosophy have been, at least recently, influenced by schools in Europe such as what's known as logical positivism or the Vienna Circle, that because of historical factors in European philosophy in the mid-20th century, rejected anything that they would term metaphysical. For the Vienna Circle, for the logical positivists, metaphysics was kind of a bad word. It was something that had the connotation of being foolish or silly or beneath something that was useful to us. And so some Buddhist interpreters have taken that on board and make a similar claim about the Buddha, that he rejected anything metaphysical for similar kinds of reasons as the logical positivists of the late 20th or mid-late 20th century. However, I want to take a little issue with that, because logical positivism came out of many things having to do really with European history, in particular the rise of the sciences, their conflict with certain ideas in religion and other kinds of philosophical systems. And so I think bringing that into early Buddhism is probably a stretch. So back to our question, where does the Buddha fit? Where does early Buddhism fit in this continuum between realism and non-realism, between thinking that these things are real existing things in the world that are separate from us versus that they're just phenomena or something like that, without any, perhaps even without any metaphysical implications? Well, I did a paper about this several years ago. It was published in the the Journal for the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies. I'll leave a link to that paper down below in the notes. It's a bit technical and deals with a lot of early Buddhist suttas. But in a nutshell, the question, where does the Buddha fit here? The answer would be nowhere. All of these kinds of schemes of realism or anti-realism, of phenomenology or the Vienna Circle and so on, all of this is really way too philosophically sophisticated to have interested the Buddha. We should, I think, remember that the Buddha did indeed reject many of the metaphysical and ontological questions of his day. He certainly rejected questions about such things as the age of the universe, or the extent of the universe, or what would happen to an enlightened person after they died, and all kinds of sort of related questions that seemed to be those that wise men of his day were supposed to have answers to. However, that said, he clearly did not reject all metaphysical questions. As I've already mentioned, he did have things to say when he was asked what exists. However, what typified his answer in those when given those kinds of questions was, we might say, a kind of a pragmatic response. Pragmatic with a small p, because there is a contemporary school of philosophy, 20th century school, called pragmatism, and he wasn't a pragmatist by 20th century standards, but he was pragmatic. What he cared about was what the philosophy had to tell us about our practice. Is there, in fact, a real world out there with real physical things, or is it all just phenomena? I would submit that for the Buddha, that kind of question would have simply been unedifying. It wouldn't have been a useful question. Who cares, as far as the Buddha is concerned? And so I don't think that, I think that if he were to be here in the room with us and been asked these kinds of questions, he probably would have said that it really didn't bear our thinking about too long. That is, the larger questions of metaphysics for the Buddha are probably questions that we should simply leave aside. Unless, and here's a point that I think does bear making, unless those questions make us prone to believe things such as solipsism. Solipsism is the pernicious view that we are the only things that exist. For example, if you take certain kinds of phenomenological theories too seriously, you're liable to think that all other beings are just phenomena in your mind stream. And so, as it were, what's the point of universal compassion? These aren't other beings. These are just phenomena out there that are just displaying in my visual consciousness. And that kind of view, I think, for the Buddha would have been pernicious, because he did believe that there were certainly other beings out there that we should be compassionate towards. So, in summary, if we look at the philosophy that we find in early Buddhism, apparently propounded by the Buddha, we find certain very real metaphysical implications about what exists and how it exists. However, all of these implications are pragmatically based. They're not intended to be a kind of foundationalist first philosophy, the way metaphysics often is perceived in the West. Instead, all of the Buddha's metaphysical claims are made on behalf of a practical kind of end, the ending of dukkha, of suffering. That the entirety of the Dharma is intended as a raft to take us over this river of samsara towards the farther shore of enlightenment, where we give up our greed and our hatred and our delusion, and are able to therefore get by without dukkha, without suffering. That was the intent of the philosophy. And so to that end, of course, he made some claims with metaphysical implications, but again, pragmatic ones. If you want to hear more about the Buddha's views that are pragmatic, I did an earlier video on the raft, the simile of the raft, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for viewing. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down in the show notes below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.